Now that we've gone over some of the more major topics regarding Pan Am's downfall, we can finally discuss the ins and outs of the business operations that caused, well, all of this. Because obviously there was more to the equation than just a single terrorist attack, or a weird scam trying to buy out the company. Now, I considered going over Pan Am's entire history for you in this video, but that's gonna take forever. Like 75,000 years. Pan Am's history is long, complicated, and very detailed. But here's what you need to know. What you need to know is that Pan Am actually started as a shell company in an attempt to deal with a German-owned business down in Colombia called SCADTA. Pan American Airways Incorporated was founded March 14th, 1927. So they were a very old airline. From there, things get, again, complicated. But eventually they grew to be a proper airline through mergers and buyouts and things of that nature. And they wound up peaking as a carrier in the late 1960s and early 1970s. They advertised themselves as the world's most experienced airline based off of their history, and they carried 6.7 million passengers in 1966, and by 1968, they flew to 86 countries on every single continent across the globe, except for Antarctica. They didn't go there. But why would they? Let's be fair. Despite their gargantuan size, they were profitable. They were making money. They were doing really, really well. Their cash reserves totaled $1 billion. That's just reserves, just money they had kicking around. They had $1 billion just sitting around in the late 60s. That's $6.69 billion in 2023. But the point is, they had a lot of money. They were wealthy, successful, and it didn't seem like anything could really stop them. They even started experimenting with other offerings, like a helicopter shuttle that ran in 1964, though those sorts of services are rarely profitable, and it wasn't even in Pan Am's case. But the point is, they could afford to try it. They were well regarded for their very modern fleet, innovative cabin designs, and experienced crews. Often their staff were multilingual and college graduates hired from around the world, some even with nursing training. The point is, you could feel safe and secure and welcome on board a Pan Am flight. They offered onboard service and cuisine that were apparently delivered with a personal flair that has rarely been equaled. It's a far cry description from the flights of today, in which the airlines cram you like sardines into the tightest quarters possible and barely offer anything in the way of meals or anything like that. It just isn't the way it used to be back when Pan Am was doing this. And they were a big part of West German operations as well. See, after World War II, things changed a lot for Germany because they had been very, very, very naughty, and they had to be put in timeout. One of the big agreements among the Allied forces was that Germany wasn't allowed to have their own airlines for quite a long time, but they recognized that someone still had to operate an airline there, so they were going to do it. Pan Am was one of the major holders here, and helped operate what was known as the Internal German Services, or IGS. Due to tensions escalating with the Soviet Union, they often had to fly over what was considered hostile territory, and when it came to West Berlin in particular, for a time they accounted for more than half the city's entire commercial air traffic. It was actually one of their biggest moneymakers, because more passengers boarded Pan Am flights at Berlin Tempelhof than any other airport in the world. They utilized German flight attendants, but American pilots, and it was a big part of their operations for years. They were doing so well that in 1970, they invested in a large fleet of Boeing 747s, in anticipation of air travel increasing. Now, the introduction of the 747 was actually good on paper. They were great planes, and Pan Am made a big show of it, flying many 747s to major airports where the public could actually tour them. The inaugural service happened on the evening of January 21st, 1970, though it was delayed for several hours due to an engine failure on Clipper Young America that was supposed to do it. Clipper Victor was used instead. They had initially placed an order for 25 747s in April of 1966, spending $525 million on them. But again, these were excellent planes, wide bodies, having more room for passengers. But right after their introduction is when things started going downhill for the company. Pan Am had grown a little complacent with themselves. They were doing well, and they were, of course, innovating, seemingly doing everything right, but there were things outside their control that started really affecting them quite badly. The 1973 oil crisis caused a lot of problems. For one thing, people had less money because they were spending more on gas, and therefore they were flying a lot less. And Pan Am was particularly vulnerable to this kind of thing because they had very high overhead as a result of large decentralized infrastructure. They had gotten away with this for so long because they were making so much money. It was fine for them. But, when you're in a crisis and less people are flying and, oh, right, you are also paying more for fuel, that doesn't really help. Plus, while they had invested in brand new 747s, some of their fleet was pretty old, and they were less fuel efficient, burning more money every time they flew, and it wasn't so easy to just go in and replace them, at least not all at once. By 1976, Pan Am had racked up about, $364 million of accumulated losses over a 10-year period, and they were about $1 billion in debt. So they're already in a pretty bad shape. This threatened them with bankruptcy at the time, and their president, William T. Sewell, began implementing a turnaround strategy. He started trimming down their network, not unlike a railroad would do in terms of cutting unprofitable routes. Their total network fell by about 25%, and they slashed their workforce by 30%. They cut wages and reduced the size of the fleet. Those measures, while brutal, did help. It pulled them out of the nosedive they were in, and they were actually able to return to profitability in 1977, but just the next year, something else happened that was bad. For them, anyway. Good for most others, but really bad for them. United States President Jimmy Carter signed into law the Airline Deregulation Act in October of 1978. This removed federal government control over a lot of the aspects of the aviation industry. See, prior to that, a group known as the Civil Aeronautics Board regulated domestic interstate routes. They set most of those, as well as the schedules and the fares. And if all this sounds just a little familiar to you, yes, they are, in effect, the airline equivalent of the ICC, which we've talked about in many of my railroad downfall videos. But the Airline Deregulation Act dropped them out of the equation, giving the market a lot more freedom, and that was really good for a lot of struggling airlines, but really bad for Pan Am. See, prior to that, they had had a significant market share, but suddenly, a lot of other companies could, compete with them, and grow, and do things that, meant that they would have less of a market share, and they weren't used to that. They weren't used to having a challenge and having to try, and they weren't really sure what to do about it. A lot of other airlines, like Southwest, operated as low-cost carriers. People were willing to forego Pan Am's notorious luxury if it meant, just getting to where they were going. And one of the first things they did was buy another airline. See, one of Pan Am's other problems was a lack of feeder routes, bringing more passengers into their major hubs. These feeder services were a little lacking when it came to Pan Am, and they had lost several bids to acquire some, particularly in the domestic market. So, in order to deal with this, Sewell, still in control of Pan Am, decided to try to just straight up buy another airline, National Airlines. They wound up in a bidding war with Frank Lorenzo's Texas International. And this bidding war actually boosted National Airlines' stock price. But Pan Am was granted permission to buy National in 1979. The problem with this is that they, well in excess overpaid for National Airlines. They were not worth what Pan Am put forward. They acquired them for $437 million, and the acquisition was completed by January 7th, 1980. But this only further burdened Pan Am's balance sheet. They just spent so much money on this airline, and for what? You're already in debt. What are you doing? Well, of course, the plan here was that now we have all these feeder routes, and that'll help. But they didn't really take a good, honest look at National Airlines, routes. it didn't really help them at all when it came to this kind of thing, especially when they were still trying to deal with lower-cost competitors in a deregulated industry. National had a north-south route structure, and that didn't feed Pan Am's transatlantic and trans-Pacific gateways. Those were major hubs that needed more feeder routes, and National didn't actually do that. It didn't help that, with the exception of the Boeing 727, National Airlines came with a completely incompatible fleet, as well as a different corporate culture, something akin to the whole Penn Central thing. Pan Am management handled the integration really poorly, and labor costs rose because they had to harmonize National's pay scales with their own. Revenues did technically increase by 62% between 1979 and 1980, but fuel costs from the merger increased by an outrageous 157%. There were also other miscellaneous expenses that increased by 74%. The point was, this did nothing to help them. They lost money on it in every conceivable way. Their situation only got worse into 1980, and as a result, Sewell decided he would have no other choice than to start selling off Pan Am's non-core assets, the first of which was their 50% interest in Falcon Jet Corporation in August. Later in November, they sold the Pan Am building to the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company for $400 million. In September of 1981, they sold off their Intercontinental Hotel chain, and before that transaction closed, Sewell would be replaced by a man named C. Edward Acker, who was Air Florida's founder and former president, as well as a former executive for Braniff. But Acker didn't do much differently from Sewell. He still continued with the asset disposal program, and followed it up with operational cutbacks. He discontinued round-the-world service, starting on October 31st, 1982, choosing to cease flying between Delhi, Bangkok, and Hong Kong due to the fact that the flight was simply unprofitable, which, frankly, isn't unreasonable. Despite the fact that they were still not in a good financial situation whatsoever, it was getting really terrible, Acker still decided to go ahead with a fleet restructuring plan in the summer of 1984. Now, at face value, that seems like a really dumb idea, given they didn't have the money for this, but also, they kind of did need to update their fleet. He wasn't wrong. It was bad if they did do it, but it was also bad if they didn't do it, so he was like, you know what, the heck with it. Newer planes might mean lower fuel costs. So they went ahead with an order for new Airbus models, in both wide-body and narrow-bodied aircraft, becoming the second American company to order Airbuses, after Eastern Airlines already had. These aircraft were a lot more advanced, and both economically and operationally superior to the 747s and 727s that they had, so they could have saved them money in the long run. They just had to last that long. They started using the new A310-221s, replacing the 727s they had been utilizing on the internal German services routes, and A300s flew in the Caribbean networks later that same year. Early in 1986, they got a hold of new, longer-range A310-222s, which replaced some of the 747s on the trimmed-down transatlantic network. And all this sounds pretty good. These are good planes, more economical, they should be able to be handled just fine. Except, then they followed it up with not taking a delivery of A320s, deciding instead to sell its delivery positions to Braniff. The problem with this decision is that it meant that regardless of these new planes, the majority of their short-haul routes, both for the US domestic market and the European feeder market, as well as most of the IGS services, were still flown with obsolete 727s. They didn't have anything to replace most of those, because they didn't take the A320s. Like, why? That's still your problem. Just take the stupid planes. Like, dang it, if you're gonna do the fleet restructuring, you have to commit with it. You can't just go halfway. But they did, and that put them at a major disadvantage against a lot of their rivals, who were operating state-of-the-art aircraft with even greater passenger appeal. Compared to the outdated 727s, a lot of the new planes just looked a lot nicer. And they also decided to do something just monumentally stupid, just unreasonably, impossibly dumb. And I still cannot believe this is what they decided to do. But they were in such bad shape that in April of 1985, Acker opted to sell, the entirety of Pan Am's Pacific division. The whole thing. That was 25% of their entire route system, and that included their major hub at Tokyo Narita, and they sold it to United Airlines for $750 million. This is a problem because, well, yes, it gave them $750 million, and that's really nice, but it meant that you no longer have access to any of that, and a major competitor, United, does. So they're going to use it to outcompete you. Because you can't possibly compete in that market anymore. It doesn't exist as far as you're concerned, because you sold the whole thing. Why did you do that? It did, to be fair, enable them to address a lot of their fleet incompatibility issues that were related to the National Airlines acquisition disaster. And it also happened the same year as a month-long strike that occurred at the hands of the Transport Workers Union of America. But their lack of feeder flights never really got fixed at any point. They contracted with a lot of regional airlines, like Air Atlanta, Colgan Air, etc., to operate such feeder flights under the Pan Am Express branding. But that meant they had to pay someone else to do it, not actually do it themselves. Though they did acquire a Pennsylvania-based commuter airline known as Ransom Airlines for $65 million, to address the issue of providing additional feed for their mainline services at their hubs in New York, LA, and Miami, as well as Berlin and Germany. They renamed the whole thing Pan Am Express. But just like with National, it really only offered an incremental increase to the route system, especially since with the Pacific region gone, they only had to focus on the Atlantic division, and they can only do so much. They then spent more money, again, $100 million to be precise, to purchase New York Air's shuttle service between Boston, New York, and Washington, D.C., which was renamed Pan Am Shuttle, operating out of LaGuardia Airport. That was great and all, but it still didn't actually address the problem of you not having a strong domestic feeder network. If the people can't get to your major hubs, you are not going to make nearly as much money as you otherwise would. And you're not fixing this. And in January of 1988, Acker was replaced by a man named Thomas G. Plaskett, who was a former American Airlines and Continental executive. A program to refurbish Pan Am aircraft and improve the company's on-time performance began showing positive results. Well, December 21st, 1988 happened. Pan Am Flight 103. As I mentioned, I already made a whole video about that, and it was a disaster in every conceivable way. I don't want to go into too much detail here, because, like I said, it has its own video, but it was a terrorist attack, and it wasn't necessarily directly Pan Am's fault, but they wound up holding some responsibility, as it was discovered they weren't doing, anything of what they were supposed to do when it came to security. They were still using outdated X-ray screening, and weren't even doing that correctly. One of the security personnel claimed she didn't even know what Semtex was, which is the plastic explosives used in this bombing. On top of this, Pan Am had been charging a surcharge to all their customers for what they claimed was extra security, while, at the same time, providing less than adequate security. They were doing the opposite while charging for it. Like, are you kidding me? In December of 1988, the FAA wound up fining Pan Am for 19 separate security failures, but the biggest hit they took was public opinion. Flight 103 was international news. It was a big deal. It was the worst terrorist attack in the UK's history. When it was realized that Pan Am bore some level of responsibility, well, people simply didn't want to fly with them anymore. Not just because they felt unsafe, but even if they could get over that, they didn't really want to support a company that, basically through sheer ineptitude, allowed a terrorist attack to happen. So they went with other competitors, which was the worst thing that could have happened to Pan Am at that point. In June of 1989, Plaskett then attempted to purchase another airline, Northwest, throwing $2.7 billion on the table, because apparently they really had that. It was, however, backed up by Bankers Trust, Morgan Guarantee Trust, Citicorp, and Prudential Bach. This merger would, in theory, allow them to actually create a strong domestic network and provide sufficient feeder flights for the two remaining mainline hubs at New York JFK and Miami. But the whole thing got kneecapped. A billionaire financier, Al Cecchi outbid Pan Am by presenting Northwest directors with a better proposal, and as such, it didn't happen, meaning Pan Am would have to truck on as they were. But then something else beyond their control happened again. The first Gulf War, which was triggered by the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait on August 2nd, 1990, caused fuel prices to rise yet again. That and the economic downturn resulted in a severe lack of people flying, pushing many profitable operations, and Pan Am, right down into the red. They began selling routes again to try to tread water, such as the one serving London Heathrow, to United Airlines again. The thing about the London Heathrow one is that might have been Pan Am's most important international destination, and they just sold it to United again. United only exists in the way they do because Pan Am just gave them this stuff, you know? And while that did give them money, sure, it also left them with only 2 daily London flights. They also continued disposing of a lot of other assets, including their IGS routes over in Berlin. And those measures were accompanied by the elimination of 2,500 jobs, 8.6% of their workforce. The cutbacks were announced in September of 1990, but no matter how much they did, no matter how much they screamed, no matter how much they cried, no matter how much they just cut off their own arm in order to stay alive, nothing would help. Selling off a lot of these routes had the opposite effect in the long term. Yeah, you made immediate money right then, which is great, but then you couldn't make money from that route in the future, and your competitor now has access to that thing, and is making money off of it. They weren't thinking long term, they were thinking short term, what they needed right then, right there, right now, and it killed them. On January 8th, 1991, they were forced to file for bankruptcy protections. Delta Airlines would purchase the remaining profitable assets that Pan Am had, including the remaining European routes. They also injected $100 million to become a 45% owner of a reorganized but very, very much shrunk down Pan Am that was still serving the Caribbean market, as well as Central and South America, from their main hub in Miami. The airline's creditors would hold the other 55%, waiting patiently for their money. In October of 1991, former Douglas aircraft executive Russell Ray Jr. was hired as Pan Am's new president and CEO. As part of that restructuring plan, Pan Am would relocate their headquarters from the Pan Am building in New York City to new offices in the Miami area in preparation for their relaunch. Because at the time, they were still thinking they might be able to come back from this. They would be able to fly again, but things didn't go that way. The new airline was planned to operate around 60 aircraft and generate $1.2 billion in annual revenues with 7,500 employees. This was all on paper, of course, but hey, it sounded pretty good. And they did, in fact, relaunch. But they continued to sustain heavy losses. That $1.2 billion in annual revenue just did not happen at all. And Delta themselves, again a major stakeholder, claimed that Pan Am was losing $3 million a day, which undermined pretty much everyone's confidence in a future for Pan Am at all. The senior executives outlined a projected shortfall between $100 million and maybe $200 million, with the airline requiring a $25 million installment just to fly through the following week at that point. On the evening of December 3rd, 1991, Pan Am's creditors committee advised U.S. bankruptcy judge Cornelius Blackshear that they were close to convincing an airline, in this case was TWA, to invest $15 million to keep Pan Am going. The deal with TWA didn't actually amount to anything. Their owner, Carl Icahn, just, didn't want to. Pan Am did open for business at 9 a.m., but within an hour, Russell Ray Jr. was forced to withdraw Pan Am's plan of reorganization and execute an immediate shutdown plan for the airline. They ceased operations on December 4th, 1991, following a decision by Delta CEO Ron Allen and other senior executives not to go ahead with the final $25 million payment Pan Am was scheduled to receive the weekend after Thanksgiving. As a result, 7,500 employees lost their jobs, thousands of whom had worked in the New York City area, and were actually preparing to move to the Miami area to continue working at Pan Am. Pan Am's last flight was 4:36, departed that day from Bridgetown, Barbados at 2 p.m., heading to Miami under the command of Captain Mark Pyle. The plane was Clipper Goodwill, a Boeing 727-200, registration number N368PA. But it didn't end there. Oh no, there was a lot more to this story. Delta would wind up being sued for more than $2.5 billion on December 9th, 1991, by the Pan Am Creditors Committee. And then a large group of former Pan Am employees also sued Delta, since it was effectively their fault that Pan Am had been forced to fold when they did. Granted, they were gonna do that, and Delta probably made the right call, but the creditors and the employees were mad because, well, Delta had taken the rug out from under them. But in December of 1994, a federal judge ruled in favor of Delta, including that, simply put, as you likely can see, it really wasn't their fault. And to be fair, they weren't the only airline to fail at that time. In 1991 alone, both Eastern and Midway also filed for bankruptcy. Russell Ray Jr. would then be replaced, after only 2 months, by Peter McHugh, whose responsibility was to supervise the sale of Pan Am's remaining assets by Pan Am's Creditors Committee to try to make back as much money as they reasonably could. Their last remaining hub, Miami, was split during the following years between United and American Airlines. TWA's Carl Icahn purchased Pan Am Express at a court-ordered bankruptcy auction for just $13 million, and he renamed it Transworld Express. To this day, the only remaining element of Pan Am that's still around is their International Flight Academy, located in Miami. Under the terms of the bankruptcy, that was allowed to stay open. It was established as an independent training organization beginning in 1992 under its current name, Pan Am International Flight Academy. They utilized the flight simulation and type rating training center of the defunct Pan Am, and in 2006, American Capital Strategies invested $58 million into the academy. Their parent organization these days is a Japanese airline, All Nippon Airways, as of October 2014, but Pan Am International Flight Academy is still operated, and it's the only surviving division of Pan American World Airways. There have been multiple attempts to reignite Pan Am as a proper airway. The first one didn't work, or the second, or the third, or the fourth, or the fifth time they tried it. Look, Pan Am is gonna stay dead. No one can get this thing off the ground for whatever reason. Sometimes it's criminally related. They're all stories in and of themselves, so I'm not even gonna touch those today. The point is, Pan American is gone, and likely always will be. Though, bizarrely, for a long time, their name did stay around on not just the Flight Academy, but also a railway? Yeah, really. In 1998, Guilford Transportation Industries purchased Pan American World Airways and all related naming rights, as well as the intellectual properties. They were later operated as Pan Am Railways, which, okay. I guess it is kind of a familiar brand. Don't know why you'd put it on a railway since it's associated with planes, but hey, they did it for quite a long time. Until 2022 when they were acquired by CSX, so hey, you know, that's something, I guess. When it comes to my personal opinion on the fall of Pan Am, well, a lot of it wasn't their fault, let's be fair. Those economic hardships had nothing to do with them. But also, they sold a lot of stuff to try to tread water, and they kind of needed the stuff they were selling, is my whole thing. The decision to sell the entirety of the Pacific network was insane to me. And I understand you have a lot of overhead, but you can shrink that in other ways besides emboldening your competitors by giving them a significant part of the market. Like, they effectively just chopped pieces off of themselves to try to stay alive in a bid that reeks of desperation. They obviously didn't really know what to do, and in the end, they're mostly just a memory now. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders, Some Dude 267, Orange Glass, Benjamin Owens, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Jack Carson's Railroad Videos, Lord Off 444, Iserfer 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matt Weaver, Tom Redlion, NS Productions 8104, Wheeljack 8401, Rescues Greyhounds, The Baxter, Caleb Crosswhite, Andrew Bowen, Josh Johnson, Caleb Brain Waters, Perez Drenton, Master of None, Travis Dolinsky, Jared Brussel, JBL Explorers, Tommy Rossini, Ben McCullough, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Mark Holding, G Wiz, Mr. Terevel, Hayden DeGrow, Metal for Life Guy, No, Kurt Forcum, Ohio Trucker 1, Mr. Sleeper, Dr. Razor 78, DM Trouble Typhoon, Harry, Drew Debris, George Kenny, Kevin Wood, Liam Wright, Morris Hillman Productions, NJ1969, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Hannah Bird, Western Colorado History, AET Museum, Ryan Wehofer, Duraushi, Murder Drones Doll, Williard Conklin, Windy City Rails, A Person 723, William Nemo, and of course, my dad. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fun farewell.